Now, I'll get on to something else. There's a massive gap between the amount of cash in the economy and the amount accepted as being used for cash payments. The difference is apparently officially dismissed as hoarding of cash or due to hoarding of cash. What proof can you offer to show cash is being hoarded rather than cash payments simply being understated?
Shall I answer that one?
Well, perhaps as my colleague has disclosed, we use our consumer payments survey to show us the number of payments that are being used typically in cash. So that gives us an indication, and we've had a history of using that data. So we do know that cash payments have fallen. And again, there will be separate individual circumstances, but as a general trend, we know cash has fallen. We can compare that with the amount of cash on issue, and as we bring those two concepts together, we can see that cash payments are falling based on our survey data and also based on discussions that we have with industry members such as retailers and banks. And then when we compare the amount of cash on issue, which is actually quite high, those two concepts brought together suggest to us that there are consumers who have accumulated cash and they are keeping it for reasons of their own, which is referred to typically as hoarding.
Okay. When was the last survey? Sorry? What was it?
Just can I ask a follow-up question? Senator Brockman, just a follow-up question on that. I mean, the difference that Senator Roberts is asking about there, though, is quite, enormous. I mean, I think there was, over $100 billion of cash in circulation, and yet, the amount, and that went up by 7% odd in the 22 financial year, and yet the amount of cash that's being used in your assessment of the economy is relatively small and declining. I mean, it's an extraordinary statement, I think, from the Reserve Bank to say that percentage of $100 billion is being hoarded. I mean, surely there's got to be other explanations.
Sorry, I was just going to expand a little bit, if I could, on some of those statistics. So some research that our colleagues did, which was published in January, showed that suggested that using a variety of methods, up to 80% of the stock of banknotes in circulation were used for hoarding purposes or non-transactional purposes, and cash, as well as transactions, cash is used for people value holding cash for precautionary purposes, natural disasters, for example, or when electronic payment systems aren't operational. We know that people hold cash as what you might call a store of wealth. And one thing we observed, which I think you referred to, is that during times of uncertainty, what we see in the data is that demand for the high denomination banknotes, the 50s and 100s, which are typically used less, but transaction demand for those denominations does tend to spike quite sharply, as it did in COVID and before that, the GFC and those types of times where there's a general sense of uncertainty. People do value holding cash more than they otherwise would.
I mean, I accept that, but I still think that $80 billion, which is effectively you're saying is sitting in the economy as dead money, seems like a huge amount, but I'll hand back to Senator Roberts.
Thank you, Senator Brockman. When was the last survey done on cash? What was the date?
The last consumer payments survey was done in 2022, I believe late 2022, around sort of October, November time.
Thank you. We've heard from constituents and social media and other sources that many more people are now using cash because of what happened during the COVID mismanagement, threatening the use of cash in the future, withdrawing the use of cash because of the digital identity bill that's coming up before the Senate day after tomorrow, other forms of control that are being set up that some people fear, including myself, that watching the bank's behaviour, fearing driving out cash and ending cash and converting totally to digital. When was the last survey? Because we've heard a lot of people saying they have now started using cash much more. Sorry, in the last 2 years. Is that plausible? Because that you don't know of the latest uptick in cash?
What we can see in the data that we have available to us since that survey was done in 2022, which is other relatively higher frequency data on things like ATM withdrawals, which seems to have stabilised somewhat in the last couple of years. So what we saw in the consumer payment surveys in 2022, there was a very significant step down in the use of cash since the previous survey was done in 2019, which covers the COVID pandemic period. So there was a step down in the use of cash for everyday payments during that period. But what we can tell from the more recent data, which isn't that type of survey evidence, is that the use of cash for transactions does seem to have stabilised somewhat, or it hasn't continued that very sharp downward trend as best we can tell from the aggregate data.
Thank you. I forgot about the COVID example COVID period where many people did use digital payment. My last question, did the Reserve Bank set up a roundtable regarding cash handling, and can you tell me who was at the table, please?
The Reserve Bank did host a roundtable at the end of October last year. The attendees were, I can send you the specific attendees on notice, but broadly speaking, there was the Governor, there were representatives from the major banks and from Armaguard, and Treasury was also present as observers.
So there were no smaller cash handling companies like Commander, for example, and other companies?
The purpose of the roundtable was really to gather industry participants to discuss the fragility of the wholesale banknote distribution cycle, and that is the part of the cash cycle between ourselves as the sole issuer of banknotes and the banknote distribution framework participants, which are essentially the major banks. We were discussing that leg of the cash cycle, and that involves those parties who are present at the table.
Armaguard, but not, say, Commander?
Commander is not a cash in transit company that is used for that leg of the cash cycle.
Okay, could it be used?
Well, there's a framework which is on our website that other organisations who may want to get the status that they need to have to be part of that cycle, but it is a very onerous obligation. We put significant requirements given the value that's being transported. We have various audit and security obligations, but if an organisation can meet those obligations, then they can become what we call, they can become a cash in transit organisation that's part of that cycle.
Have you considered other companies other than Armaguard?
We do not have a relationship with Armaguard for that part of the cash cycle. That relationship is held between the banknote distribution framework participants and agreement participants, which are the major banks. They have the relationship with the CIT. So they have the relationship with Armaguard. We do not have the relationship with Armaguard.
Thank you both. Thank you, Chair.